participants on here, and we'll say hi and thank you to Representative Finkenauer in just a second here. We're having some connectivity issues, but we think we'll get those resolved here in just a second. So let me do the quick hello and some of our preliminary information so that we get that out of the way. As I was just joking offline as we started, I think a number of the participants on the call today have been on all four of our forums, and I sure appreciate the interest that you've had in these and your participation. We do these by special invite and try to keep a pretty limited audience so that we can take your questions, so that we can ask some really specific issues of the candidates. And I certainly believe have a higher level, more sophisticated conversation than some of the other forums that you may have seen this election season. So again, thanks to all of you that have participated. Many of you have already sent questions in ahead of time, as has been the case with all of these forums. I'm armed and loaded with questions already before we get started here. But we will have an opportunity after Representative Finkenauer is finished with her comments to take additional questions. You can use the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screen, as so many of us are used to using now on these Zoom calls. And please submit questions, and I've got staff here that are helping filter those, and we'll get to as many as possible. I want to remind everyone again why we do this, why we invest the time and the logistics in doing these invites and getting this audience. The Economic Alliance is a nonpartisan membership organization. We do not endorse candidates at any level of government, but we are very active in public policy, in advocacy, in working with local, state, and federal government on issues that are important to our region and to our state, particularly those issues that relate to business success, to economic growth, to population growth, to workforce growth. And educating our members on those issues and where candidates stand on them is a really important part of what we do and an important part of our advocacy strategy. And that's certainly why we've invited both of the Senate candidates and both of the 1st Congressional District candidates to join us and be part of this. Policies that grow our population, grow our economy, grow our workforce cover a lot of what we do, a lot of our agenda, a lot of our legislative priorities. And that also covers a lot of the work of Impact CR. That's our young professionals group, and we are certainly honored and proud to partner with Impact CR in this series of forums in talking to our candidates. Pocket is with us today representing Impact CR. You'll hear from him in just a little bit, and he will ask some questions from a young professional's standpoint, from a young professional's point of view. And we're awfully glad to do this in partnership, in collaboration with Impact CR. Our advocacy on issues that grow the region and state, as I said, tend to be pretty bipartisan in nature. A lot of the questions that we'll ask today are ones that have support on both sides of the aisle. And in the past few years, this has really become an important part of our success. As the two sides have been challenged to work with each other more and more in the political environment that we have today, it's certainly refreshing to be able to work on bipartisan issues and work on issues that all sides can often come together and agree on. And it's also why we've been really committed to this principle of civility. A couple of years ago, we added a tenet in our principles document that talked about civility. We hadn't typically done that before, but it became awfully important in our discussions with our members and the kind of thing that we wanted to promote, to actually have a principle that talked about political civility. We remain very strong advocates of the First Amendment, certainly appreciate the rights of anybody to speak up with their opinion, but we also encourage elected officials, candidates, and citizens to be civil in discussions and debates on policy issues and political opinions. And we're certainly committed to leading by example. And I think you'll hear that as we go through the forum today. Representative Finkenauer, hello, and thanks for joining us.
Hi there, thank you. I'm glad I figured out the link finally.
Fantastic. You've missed nothing but some of my rigmarole that you've heard from me before, and we'll be able to revisit again. Just quickly going over some ground rules and a little bit about the Economic Alliance. So I'll finish up quickly here, do a quick introduction of you, and then turn it over to you. Okay, I'm glad you got connected, and it's so great to see you.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug.
I want to mention for the participants and for Representative Finkenauer as well, we do have a few members of the media joining us today. They're here to listen, and really the opportunity to ask questions is reserved for the Economic Alliance members and the business leaders that are on the call today. And I appreciate that fact. When I've finished introducing Representative Finkenauer, we'll have a chance to hear directly from her, and then we'll begin the Q&A session. As I already talked about, please use the Q&A on the Zoom, and I will ask many of the questions that have already been submitted. So with that, let me jump right into an introduction of our special guest today. Abby Finkenauer is serving her first term as U.S. Representative for Iowa's 1st District. Congresswoman Finkenauer was raised in Sherrill, Iowa, a small town in rural Dubuque County. At 16, she served as a congressional page for U.S. Congressman Jim Nussle, who also represented Iowa's 1st District. She later served as a speaker's page in the Iowa House of Representatives and a legislative assistant to Iowa State Representative Todd Taylor. After graduating from Drake University, she was elected to the Iowa State House of Representatives at the age of 25. In November of 2018, Congresswoman Finkenauer was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, the first woman to do so from Iowa. In Congress, she serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where she is vice chair of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, and also serves on the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee. She sits on the Small Business Committee, where she chairs Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship Subcommittee, and serves as an assistant whip for the House Majority. Recently married, the Congresswoman and her husband Daniel live in Cedar Rapids. Please welcome today Congresswoman Abby Finkenauer. And Representative Finkenauer, I'm going to turn over the floor to you for some opening comments. Thank you so much for making this a priority and fitting this into your schedule and being with the business leaders of the Cedar Rapids area today.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Doug, and to the Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance and all of the membership. Thank you so much for all that you do for our community, for our state, and for our country. I know it has been a really difficult year on a number of levels, whether it's through the pandemic and folks worried about being able to, if they're able to keep their doors open, keep their folks employed, be able to have folks be able to put food on their table at the end of the day. It has been a really, really tough year, and keeping each other safe and healthy as well. You know, if there's a lot I know that you guys have been going through, and and then on top of it, obviously the derecho that hit over 2 months ago, that I know we're still recovering from, and it's going to be a long process, that we know. And yeah, as you're taking those hits to then have that on top of it, it's just, you know, just when we thought couldn't get worse, it did. And I just want to tell you, we are in this together. I am making sure, you know, that we're doing the oversight piece of things too, when it comes to FEMA, when it comes to SBA, of being able to make sure we're getting the resources in here for our businesses, but also for our residential folks as well, who are really struggling still. But we are Iowa, we are tough, we are gonna get through this. It's just, it will be a long road, and I just wanna say thank you for everything that you do, and to hang in there, but we'll get through it together. Yeah. And on top of it all, I know Doug had mentioned, I sit on Transportation Infrastructure, and I sit on Small Business Committee, and I chair Rural Development, Ag Trade, and Entrepreneurship. And I also just want to say another shout out to the Cedar Rapids Metro Economic Alliance for being such a good partner in a lot of the things that we've worked on, whether it's hosting roundtables that we've had on the STEP program, which is the State Trade Exchange Program, which actually it gives resources to our small businesses through the state to be able to expand trade. Sorry, it's a state trade expansion program to actually bring more opportunities, whether it's funding, trade shows, you name it, in different areas. And just to have that, you know, that partnership, to hear directly from business owners who've used the program, what's worked, what hasn't, was a huge help to us. And we actually just reauthorized a 5-year reauthorization of that 3 weeks ago and passed that bipartisanly through the House. And I just can't say thank you enough for your partnership on that. And then on top of it all, I sit again on transportation infrastructure. And, you know, I like to tell people, and it's true, my day in DC is very different than what you see on TV at night. It just is. The things that I work on, we find a lot of common ground on. And it doesn't really matter to me whether you're Democrat, Republican. Typically, I'm working with people regionally. So I work with a lot of Republicans up in Minnesota or Illinois, you name it, or people who live on the Mississippi, for example, on locks and dam issues, or people who have had issues with flooding in their district. That's the type of stuff we've worked on. And then also focused on rural investment as well, which has everything to do as well with how Cedar Rapids does. That's the thing about Iowa, and specifically the first district. We've got these 3 kind of hubs of economic activity in Dubuque, Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, and those areas, but then our rural areas as well, depending on how they're doing affects you, and depending on how you're doing affects them. And so we've got to make sure that everybody is strong here, and that these investments are getting everywhere in our communities and not just to our bigger cities as well. And so that's been one of my top priorities, especially as somebody who's grown up in a rural area, who saw a lot of my friends move away after high school or college, and I want them to be able to come back home. And now, as we're going through this pandemic, you're having a lot of folks who are thinking about, you know, moving to smaller towns again, or moving back to where they grew up in Iowa, whether that is Cedar Rapids or wherever it may be. And this is why we've got to get so many things right coming through this pandemic to stimulate growth again, whether it's through large infrastructure investment, but also paying attention to rural broadband, for example, as well, and getting that right, because that's one of the things I saw not work well after the 2008 recession, obviously, or 2007, and we were trying to recover. We lost a lot of folks in Iowa. They moved away, went to bigger cities to be able to find opportunities, and left some of our smaller towns in Iowa. And now we've got an opportunity to bring folks back home, and we got to get it right. So these are some of the things that we're focused on, along with continued support through this pandemic. And then many other things as well, just making sure we're putting our families first. And, you know, it's been a priority for me, especially to find common ground wherever we can. And we've introduced over 20 bipartisan bills. We'll keep doing that. It's just, again, I think one of the best ways to get things done. And that's why I went to Congress. That's how I was raised here. And that's what I'll continue to do.
Very good. I appreciate those comments. Representative Finkenauer, I talked briefly in my open about our young professionals group, Impact CR, and I want to invite Pankit to turn on his video now, and he's going to ask a couple of questions on behalf and from the point of view of our young professionals group that we're partnering on the forum today. So Pankit, I'll let you do a little introduction of yourself and then take away a couple of questions for the representative.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Representative, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. So as Doug mentioned, my name is Pankit Kotecha. I am a program manager at Collins Aerospace. I've been a Cedar Rapids resident for 11 years now. I'm also part of the Impact CR board. As you heard from Doug and as you have known, Impact CR is the Economic Alliance's local young professionals organization. Our aim is really to create these experiences that connect and engage young professionals with peoples and places in our community. And again, that plays into the discussion that you had about how we want to retain and get people back into our communities. As we all know, millennials and Gen Z together will make up the largest population of eligible voters in this election. Historically, however, unfortunately, these groups have had some of the lowest participation rates of any generation. And that's something that we want to work with you and all the other representatives to fix. We appreciate Economic Alliance partnering with our group to offer this opportunity today. We are hoping, obviously, that the voting statistics can start changing and the young professionals are better represented at the polls. So without taking much time, we're excited to discuss some of these topics which specifically impact young professionals. So I'll just jump in with the questions.
Great.
So our first question, lack of access to childcare or unaffordable childcare is something that keeps young parents, especially women, out of the workforce. What are some of the things at the federal level do you think that can be done to help get more young parents in the workforce?
Thank you so much. That is one of the most important questions, one that we were tackling last year, but now has come to a fever pitch as well during this pandemic. That's what we've noticed about a number of issues, whether it's rural broadband or childcare. You know, this has always been a need in our country to get right, whether it's access is one piece of it, right? Making sure it's even there, but affordability is another aspect. And then also quality childcare is another one. So it's a three-pronged issue here that you can't ignore one for the other. And that's been one of my priorities, to make sure that we're continuing to highlight specifically on that. So on the Small Business Committee, I chair a subcommittee called Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship. And childcare in particular is something that really ties into the rural development piece, but also entrepreneurship, because you can't start a business if you don't have reliable, quality childcare. And so we're losing young people that could be able to begin or, you know, take a risk, start their business, you know, and do so much good for our communities, because we haven't had those resources in the way that we should all across our state. There are innovative things that are happening that we're also trying to uplift. Look at what has worked in different communities, and luckily actually in Iowa 1, we've got a lot of folks doing some of that work. In my subcommittee, we brought a gentleman actually from Waterloo who works on mostly a kind of coalition between other businesses where they can all offer childcare, but they kind of go into it together, and it's sort of a hub, and how that works. And that's the type of stuff that would be really interesting to either offer more investments, grants, you name it, to be able to stir more of that, to make sure that that's also a recruiting tool for our businesses as well, to get more young people to start. But on the other side of it as well, through this pandemic, we've got essential workers who now are still worried about childcare, who have been, we actually have lost a lot of childcare providers through the pandemic. I voted earlier in the year on a $50 billion childcare stabilization fund because of the fact the need is so great right now, and that we can't afford to lose folks right now. And in fact, we need to be expanding upon the care that is available. On top of that, we actually also had somebody testifying from my committee this time. Last year they came in person, this time it was over Zoom to keep everybody safe. But he was from Grinnell and came from the hospital system, and then worked with nonprofits and local businesses to actually, and the school district, to offer care for essential workers. And it actually didn't start out like that. It was just supposed to be a child care option, but then it turned into obviously doctors, nurses, and even child care providers themselves needing that care. And then also we've dealt with the fact that we've got folks worried, are they able to keep their kiddos safe in their care? And so it costs more. They want to do it right, but they don't necessarily always have the resources. And so I actually passed 3 weeks ago or so a bipartisan bill through the House. It was, I think it passed with 387 votes. 440 Republicans joined me. And it's one that called Child Care Safety Act. So it helps our child care providers have the access to what they need to actually keep kiddos safe in their care as well. And that's something, you know, unfortunately it is sitting over in the Senate, overwhelmingly bipartisan, could be picked up at any time and have a direct impact on our communities and our child care providers and our kiddos. So that's stuff we're going to continue to push for, but it is a large issue that I'm going to keep tackling and make sure we're hearing from Iowans again about what works and what more we can be doing.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And again, appreciate what's going on and hoping to see that turn. So on that note, it's a good segue into the next question. So you talked a lot about small businesses. So the young professionals, the young community here again is concerned is, how do we continue to support and create an environment where these young professionals and others can become small business owners and entrepreneurs?
Yeah, well, so one of the things we did on the subcommittee was actually hold hearings about the barriers for entry, really, for young people getting involved and being able to start that business. And we actually brought folks who had taken the step and were doing it. and kind of heard from them directly about what are some of the biggest challenges, one, that you still face, two, that you wish were different when you started out in the first place. And so we brought, actually, there's a woman, Acton Stout, from Marshall County. She actually has a business on Etsy, which is really interesting. And she's able to sell internationally, so across the country, but also globally as well. And she supports her family on that. And I think she's in her late 20s, early 30s, and has a daughter as well. Her husband helps with the childcare piece of it. But she said, look, if I get sick or he gets sick and isn't able to care for her, what am I supposed to do? And same thing, on the healthcare piece of it too. How am I supposed to have healthcare? So she's able to use the ACA right now. But at the same time, it is expensive. So that's why, for me, that's adding a public option so folks can buy into something like Medicare to be able to draw down those premiums. If you've got insurance that you like, you keep it. But you have an option as a small business owner to get something that's good care and also affordable as well. And then you take that piece off of the table as well when it comes to being able to start your business and feel comfortable being able to do that. And so that was one of the pieces. And then also even, retirement savings, right? Things like that, she was like, it's hard, if you have a job that does have a good retirement plan, to then take that leap to start your own business if you're not going to have that. And so being creative of new ways we can stir more of that development, especially in the gig economy, we've got to figure that out for our young people. So whether it's multi-employer pension plans or things like that we get creative about to offer that security as well, because we're going to have a whole generation of folks that don't have retirement, and they're not going to be going out on their own to start their own business if they don't have an option to actually use to save for that.
Thank you. Appreciate your answer there. Yep. So again, a good segue. You talked about just again different things that young professionals care about before starting a business. So one of the things a lot of young professionals are concerned about is that they carry a lot of student debt. Because of that student debt, they have to put off some other life milestones: getting married, buying a house, having a child, starting a business, as we're talking about. What, if any, response do we expect from the federal government as it relates to student loans?
Well, that's the topic that I've been working on for a while, since back even when I was in the State House in Iowa, as somebody who is a first-generation college grad. My parents worked hard, helped us get to college. There's 4 of us in our family. We were all first-generation college grads, and they didn't have the resources to pay for it all. So we have debt. I still around 20K or so, but that to me, that is a lot less than even a lot of other folks in Iowa, especially coming from first generation grad families. And that's a lot of folks in Iowa who've dealt with that. It's a part of why, I think you heard me say at the beginning, I've seen friends of mine move away and not be able to come back home because they've got jobs, depending on where they're at across the country, that may pay more or what have you, to help also pay off the student debt. Yes, cost of living can be more as well, but it usually balances itself out where they're able to actually pay off more of the debt, and they struggle then being able to come back home. So I actually, again, this is a thing I worked in the State House, started thinking about, okay, we need to make sure, one, yes, people are responsible when they're taking out the debt. That's important, and know what they're getting into, and having transparency is obviously very, very important here. But it's also important when we think about how people are so strapped right now with this debt, they maybe aren't able to come back home to where they grew up or what have you because of that debt. How do we create a program where we can incentivize folks to do that, and then also partner with businesses to help pay off some of that debt too, to attract the workforce that you want and that you need into your areas? And so, again, one of the bills I worked on in the State House is really reflective to a bill I'm working on in Congress as well, that has to do with areas where, whether it's states or different population centers where they have either remained stagnant in population or lost population, set up a program where you can help with debt relief, partnering with local businesses, even as a match of the federal government coming into helping match, and then over 8 years, qualify for smaller percentages or higher percentages every year that you're in the same place for forgiveness, to actually make it, again, very targeted when we're talking about student loan debt relief, and in a smart way to do it, to bring in businesses and their investment as well, because it all goes hand in hand, right? And there's studies right now that show if you're in a place for 8 years, you're gonna stay because you've put down roots. You bought that house because now you're finally able to. You're able to have kids, right? And that's what, I mean, it just, the impact that this would have on our rural communities and also just Iowa in general would be huge. So that's something, one of the creative options we've been thinking about and working on. And then refinancing, obviously student loan debt is another one. And then also one of the things I worked on is making sure that we're holding bad actors accountable. And when it comes to some of the for-profit colleges that have taken advantage of folks, very specifically our veterans we've seen, they've gone after them when it comes to preying upon them on things that, I mean, whether it's degrees that don't actually aren't accredited, or they've all of a sudden shut down. I mean, the stories we've heard are just awful. And so there's actually, it's Barrow's Defense Fund actually, that there's rules in place so that they can get relief because they did the right thing. They tried trying to, get an education or get a new school, and then were really duped out of no fault of their own, and deserve relief there too, to be able to get back on their feet. And again, whether it's going to a different college or you name it, or also invest in apprenticeship programs as well, which is incredibly important for our workforce here in Iowa.
Absolutely. All of that is, again, really appreciated, and I think on the right track of what we would like to see. So those were the questions that we had collected from the young professionals. I'm going to pass it on to Doug. And again, thank you for helping clarify some of those things for us.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Doug, I think you're on mute.
I try to get through one forum without doing that, but I don't think I still manage that. Hey, Plunkett, thank you very much. I appreciate the partnership with Impact CR, and you did a great job with that today. So thank you. We want to move on to some other questions. You've hit on a couple things already, so I'm going to skip around a little bit here and try to get to some topics that have been submitted, and try to cover as much as we can. I want to start with, and I want to try to look forward instead of back on this question about coronavirus. Obviously, Iowa is a hot spot. Our numbers are scary. We're all dealing with the economic impact of that and the public health impact of that. But looking forward, what should the country do to be better prepared for the next pandemic situation? What would you do to help ensure that America is able to respond quickly and effectively to whatever may happen next?
Well, there's a few things here. One is fully funding the CDC, making sure also that we have relationships with other countries where we know what's going on, and that we have a seat at the table when it comes to, I mean, especially when you're talking about a global pandemic, everything that's happening in every country affects us here in this country in particular. And I've been kind of discouraged with what I've seen in the last few years too, of us really taking, well, us as in the United States, pulling away from a seat at the table on a number of levels. But this would be one where obviously after this, pretty important to get back to the table and actually have a say, and also have the right information as well. On top of that, I would want to make sure that, I mean, I know you say not look backward, look forward, but there's still a lot that needs to get done right now. The fact that I've been talking to hospital administrators and they still don't have everything they need to have testing at the levels that they would like and need should not be happening. I mean, this is where Defense Production Act is important. It's okay to use it when you are in a position like this, whether it's creating more PPE. I mean, the fact that we were also in Iowa and have had a PPE shortage order, where folks were in the healthcare industry were having to reuse PPE. This should not be happening in our country. We have some of the best manufacturing in the world here in not just the country, but here in Iowa as well. And I know we've seen some folks be able to retool, and they did that voluntarily, or work with government contracts to be able to do that. Great. But there's a lot that could have been done to spur that up even more and rely less on other countries when it comes to those needs and actually create them here in the United States of America. And so that's a piece of it that I think, one, still needs to get right, and second, should be something we think about in the future as well. What is that backstop? What does happen, God forbid, if anything like this were to ever happen again? What is the plan, and who's able to retool, who can, or who's who's in that setup, depending on where you're at? What are those distribution centers looked like? Is it regional? Is it, I mean, you name it. There are plenty of things we could be doing now, but then also in the future as well. And I'm just trying to remain hopeful that we can, I mean, on top of it all, yes, get relief to folks as soon as possible. It's been a really tough year. And again, it's economic, it's health, it's everything. And the other thing I would say as well, I mean, as we're talking about things that happen, whether it's a global pandemic or whether it's a natural disaster like the derecho, making sure that the things that we saw happen here, specifically in Cedar Rapids, I mean, there wasn't a shelter until Friday after that storm. Folks didn't have food, didn't have access to get gas for generators, didn't have ice because things weren't open. It was really rough, and we all know that. We all lived through that, and I just never want to see that happen again in our country. The way that this happened was because we didn't, I mean, part of it is the fact that it's, was like a hurricane in the sense of the winds were like a hurricane category 4, but we didn't have days notice for folks to prepare. And so I'd like to see also, I've been actually talking to FEMA about this and others, how do we make sure that this works better, besides just waiting for a presidential declaration or having to be asked for it and then being approved, and then how do we get help in faster? And I, again, don't want to see any other district be put in that position ever again. So these are things we'll be looking at in the future as well.
Another thing that would be very helpful when you think about recovery from derecho, recovery from the tough economic headwinds that COVID has caused, is an infrastructure bill. This tends to be a bipartisan thing. You hear both Republicans and Democrats talk about investment in infrastructure, and there have been proposals. I want to kind of ask a two-part question here. First of all, well, and I'll pause after the first part, but I think a lot of times people, the general public, think about roads and bridges and interstates when they think about infrastructure. Our members, including a couple on the call today, we also want to be sure that you are thinking about things like airports, and you've already mentioned things like broadband, right? That's all part of infrastructure. When we think about what will drive recovery in Eastern Iowa, we think about the impact of our airport, we think about the impact of broadband, and certainly consider those infrastructure just as much as streets and bridges. So I want you to comment a little bit about maybe the importance of and/or the likelihood of an infrastructure package coming together.
Yeah. So how much time do you have? I talk about infrastructure all day long. It's one of the things that I know it is not necessarily the flashiest of headlines all the time or the most exciting tweets, but infrastructure investment and infrastructure policy is one of the things that I get most excited about, because I know that those impacts on our community are real and how they show up here. And it's why I asked to be on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in Congress. I actually am vice chair of Highways and Transit, which is where our big highway bills go through, so road bridge funding, all of that. And wanted to make sure that Iowa had a seat at the table for it, because we hadn't for a long time. And not only that, I actually brought the chairman of Transportation Infrastructure to Cedar Rapids and to our surrounding areas to see some of the needs himself, because we do have some of the most structurally deficient bridges in the entire country right here in this district, right here in Iowa, where we've got counties doing what they can with what they have, but it shouldn't have to be that way. So you're exactly right when you talk about coming through this pandemic. This is what I talk about all the time. as we talk about stimulating our economy after we come through the pandemic and make sure that folks are able to get back to work, that we have that investment in our communities, it's an infrastructure bill, hands down. Often when I'm asked what are the first two, or what's the first things you would do in the next Congress, one, if we haven't gotten a relief bill yet on the pandemic, that would be absolutely first, making sure our businesses are able to get what they need again through PPP, our communities are able to, our working families are able to keep food on their table, folks are able to keep our police officers, our firefighters employed through the city and county funding, you name it, that's important. Would be, I hope we get one before then, but if we don't, that would be first. But second, an infrastructure bill. We already passed a large one through the House this last year. It is something that I had a lot to do with in the parts of, like, for example, road and bridge funding. I worked on bipartisan bills that actually made sure that the bridge and road funding that you spent all over across the country, at least 20% of it would have to go to our rural areas and places that are on the off-highway system that are often overlooked. So fighting to actually get those dollars into Iowa. The other piece of it as well was the Helping Communities Invest in Infrastructure Act, because you can pass these bills, you can have those grants out there and available, but to make sure they actually get to Iowa, you've got to make sure that you have assistance for the cities and counties who don't necessarily have a government person, or you name it, being able to track down those grants. So it has to do with waiving fees and helping with technical assistance. Again, these are just some common sense things. And then on top of it, you know, when we passed this bill through, the chairman of Transportation Infrastructure said it was literally the best investment in rural America and rural infrastructure that has ever passed out of any chamber. And it's true. And a lot of that is because the work that we did across the aisle, talking to folks regionally. Again, I don't really care who you are, Democrat, Republican, I don't care. If we are in districts that have similar needs, we're going to work together and we're going to find common ground and we're going to try to get it done. So we've laid that out in this plan that we've passed. And not only that, I also have a lot of hope that it can actually get done in the next Congress as well, with these plans that we've laid out. I know, you know, I don't know how this presidential election goes. No one does. We're 20 some days away now. But I will tell you this, when it comes to Vice President Biden, not only had I had him commit to a large infrastructure plan at my Finkenauer fish fry that focused on infrastructure and jobs last year, where he made every Democratic candidate answer the question about a large infrastructure plan, because I knew how big this was for our state and for our local economy, but also made obviously Vice President Biden do the same. And not only that, I've heard he's been talking even to the chairman of Transportation Infrastructure, wanting to see some of this within the first few months. So that is really, really hopeful. And on top of it, when it comes to, you know, how do we pay for it and how do we make sure we get those dollars in, there's a few things here at play as well. One, there's a lot of different options on the table that can be looked at, that I know we can try to find common ground on, that we've been having those discussions. But also the biggest thing is, if we don't spend, what that ends up costing us in the end as well is huge. And also it is the best return on investment we have in this country. When we spend infrastructure dollars, it comes back to our communities, we actually get revenue, and we're able to actually even deal with a lot of other things as well. So there's a lot of, you know, on the table here when it comes to how do you pay for it, but then also the investments that it means in Iowa and in our communities.
Yeah, and of course that was my follow-on question. So you've already addressed that. I mean, you have to, you know, I think our expectation of you and everybody that serves is, I mean, we're very supportive of infrastructure investment, but certainly addressing, especially as we face a $3.3 trillion deficit right now, given all the coronavirus aid that was very naturally needed and the disruption in the economy. I think always addressing kind of that how do you pay for it question is important too. So thanks for mentioning that. I want to ask three issue-oriented questions and maybe just get briefer answers, because I do want to try to hit a couple of more lighthearted answers at the end.
You should have waited for infrastructure till the end.
No, that was good. That was perfect, and I don't no qualms about that. But I also don't want to leave some of these unanswered. So maybe just I'm going to do three quick ones here on three topics. just to make sure that we cover those, and then we'll save a little time for a couple of fun questions as well. First of these is on international trade. Again, these are selfish questions, right? This is the heart of the Iowa economy, of the Eastern Iowa economy, of manufacturing and of agriculture. And it's been a tough couple of years for farmers, for manufacturers, for many in the agribusiness community. What's next on this front related to international trade? What can be done to put our members, our manufacturers, our agribusiness members more at ease that brighter days are ahead?
Well, I can't promise you a short answer on this one, and I hope that's okay, because it's one of the most important issues on top of the pandemic, or whether it's infrastructure funding. It is the most impactful to our economy in Iowa that we are dealing with. The fact is, we entered into a trade war with China in 2018. It started with a tweet from the president on steel tariffs. And it happened to have been 4 days before Connor Lamb's special election in Pennsylvania, who was, yes, running in Pennsylvania, which is essentially steel country. Started 4 days before that, called them defense tariffs, 232s. And that's really where the trade war started. From there, China came back and retaliated and put tariffs on pork, soybeans, and corn. And we had been feeling the effects of that and the brunt of that ever since. And the fact is, look, China needed to be dealt with. There's no question. They're a bad actor on a number of levels when it comes to intellectual property, you name it. The way this was done, without bringing other countries into this with us, building leverage, put us at a disadvantage. And again, we heard a lot about short-term pain, long-term gain. We are now in long-term pain, haven't seen a lot of gain. And I've been pushing ever since I got to Congress. I've been having, whether it's the trade representatives on the phone, having deputy trade representatives in my office, making sure that they are hearing the stories of what's actually happening on the ground here in Iowa. It is not just dollars and cents you see on a page. It is people's lives. We've got farmers dipping into 401ks if they're lucky enough to have them, filing for bankruptcy. And in the meantime, aren't able to buy new equipment. And so we've got John Deere laying off folks. Those are good UAW jobs that I know folks are worried about, especially, again, as our agricultural economy hurts, so does manufacturing here in Iowa. They are tied hand in hand. You know, we've had people testify in front of our committee talking about having 3 sons. This one woman, a 6th generation farmer, she's got 3 sons, telling them not to go into farming because she's worried about their future. And then we've got manufacturers coming in as well, also worried about being able to sell, being worried about just the supply chain is an issue right now. And so these are things that we've continued to uplift to anybody who would listen. And honestly, there are days where I've said this before, but yes, my day is not like what you see on TV at night. We work across the aisle most of the day, but we also work on issues that don't necessarily get covered. And these are the things like trade that I would wake up thinking about, go to bed thinking about at night, in the middle of the day, uplifting it to anybody who would listen, including our senators, and to just uplift the fact that, yes, we're happy we got the USMCA done, the updated version. That was something we were happy to work on, but we still are in this trade war with China. They are not coming through with their end of the deal. And honestly, I'm not surprised, because we've been told time and time again that we were going to get a deal. It was going to be great. We're still not at that point yet. Our farmers are still hurting. Our manufacturing sector is still hurting. And we need to have leadership when it comes to these trade deals that can build coalitions, bring countries together, and get good deals for our country and for our workers. And unfortunately, we are not seeing that right now when it comes to China. And it is one of the biggest impacts we've seen. And by the way, the longer this goes on, our farmers have been losing contracts that they've had with soybeans over decades. And the longer this happens, the faster Brazil is deforesting, planting more soybeans, and taking over those contracts. And on top of it, if we don't invest in our infrastructure and update our locks and dams, it's another hit to trade that we can't afford to take. It's why we've had a competitive advantage, because of those locks and dams and how we can move goods. And again, if God forbid one of those goes down, what that means globally, but also here in Iowa, is too huge to even imagine. So again, there's a lot that is tied together here. I couldn't give you a short answer, and I could also talk about this all day long.
Right. I'm gonna hit one more weighty issue. I know when we've had roundtables with you, we've been able to really focus on some very individual legislation, and maybe that's an FYI for the people here. Today's forum, we did want to touch on some of those big weighty ones, so we maybe didn't get to as much as we wanted, but let me hit one instead of two more really weighty issues, and then still hope to get to a couple of fun questions that I want to end with. We have written a lot of letters, done a lot of advocacy, and have taken a lot of strong positions as the Economic Alliance and on behalf of our members related to immigration. Particularly, our voice has been there on DACA. In particular, our voice has been there on behalf of businesses fighting to try to expand visas and address workforce advantages. We've been working sort of against the Trump administration on a number of these issues. I want to give you a chance to express your thoughts on immigration policies and the path forward.
Yeah, well, number one thing here, especially when it comes to immigration, is we've got to find more common ground than there is right now. We've got to be able to take the fear and division out of the topic. This is something that matters a great deal to our country, and also to get right is the right thing to do. One of the things in particular, you brought up DACA. We did pass the DREAM Act out of the House, and unfortunately the Senate hasn't done anything with it yet. That to me is also a values issue as well, and part of why I supported it. Second of all, you're right. I know in particular in our community here in Cedar Rapids, that's actually something I've talked to when it comes to visas, work visas, you name it, or even pathways to citizenship. A discussion we've had a lot with some of the workforce here in Cedar Rapids that we've signed on to different bills about or have been working towards. And the other thing as well is just, again, take out the fear and division and figure out how can we make these policies actually work for states like Iowa and get it right. I mean, heck, even the Keeping Physicians Serving Patients Act, that's another bill that I worked on that has to do with making sure we have doctors in our rural areas and in different specialties. So it doesn't matter where you live in Iowa, you should still be able to get the same care anywhere else. But we always run out of our visa waivers essentially almost immediately in this region. And then you've got areas like around California, they never use all of their waivers. They don't need to, they don't have to. But in Iowa, we do. And so I went and spoke to somebody down in Marshalltown, and it was one of the hospital administrators. They had a psychiatrist. They had all ready to go, but we had run out of our region's waivers and they weren't able to get them. And so the Keeping Physicians Serving Patients Act actually doesn't add anymore, but takes the unused waivers from these different regions and then reallocates them to places that need them. And that's just common sense policy that, again, we should be able to come together on.
Oh, very good. Who is your best Republican friend in Congress, and how did you get to become friends?
Congressman John Curtis of Utah. Actually, he's the one I did my first bill with. 2 weeks into it, I actually got to meet Congressman Curtis because he lives across the hall from me, and works across the hall from me. Some of them live there, I do not. But anyway, he works across the hall from me in Cannon House office building, and we got to know each other. And the first bill we did was Stimulating Innovation Through Procurement Act of 2018, which had to do with creating more opportunities in our rural areas or some of our cities and states that are often overlooked when it comes to government contracts and innovation and creating those opportunities. And so we worked together and got that done. And he's actually been a good friend ever since. Actually, he's known for his socks apparently in Congress. So I got cool pair of Congressman Curtis socks for my birthday last year. One of the most unique birthday presents I got. But yeah, just a good guy that we don't agree on everything at all. But we found a lot of ways to, support each other through whether the bills we're working on or even bouncing ideas off of each other.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. This, while not maybe as weighty or as complex as other issues, this is a serious issue. I don't mean to make light of this at all. It's certainly important to us, but want to ask you about, but a little different than some of the other questions we've asked today. The Iowa caucuses, potentially in trouble. I think it'll likely take a unified and bipartisan effort to save our first in the nation status for the next time around. How will you stand up with Republicans and likely over the objections of some in your party who would like to see a system other than Iowa first to ensure the nation of the integrity and the importances of Iowa caucuses? And maybe as part and parcel of that same answer, any thoughts about increasing voter turnout and participation in the caucuses, which is often cited as one of the drawbacks of having caucuses?
Yeah, this same way we've always been, joining forces with Republicans to be able to uplift this and make sure that both parties understand the importance of it. Obviously, it feels like almost every caucus there's this discussion and there's this pushback, and we've been able to keep them and then make changes where necessary. I know some of those changes were made this year where we could make them more accessible, but there's more work to be done to make them more accessible. And I look forward to continuing to work with anybody on that. Again, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter, to be able to get that right and to be able to, again, advocate for keeping these for our state, because they are so important to make sure that Iowa has a seat at the table and some of the first voices at the table as well when it comes to policy and then the new plans of possibly a new president.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for joining us today, for making this a priority. It certainly means a lot to us that we were able to do this. To the participants on the call, this is the fourth and final of our forums. We were able to get both Senate candidates and both 1st Congressional District candidates. We did record all of these sessions, and now that all 4 of those are done, we will be posting those on our webpage. If you know of others that might be looking to educate themselves on the issues, to educate themselves on the candidates, please feel free to forward that link and have them take a look at the questions that we ask and the responses that we received. Thank you very much for being educated citizens, for being business leaders and community leaders here in our region. And I don't think I really even need to say it to this particular audience, but obviously just a few weeks out here, please vote and do take your responsibility to democracy and get out and vote. So Representative Finkenauer, thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody who participated and watched, and thanks Pinkett as well. And I'm just really grateful to have been able to join you.
Very good. Thanks everybody. We're adjourned. Thank you.